Welcome back. Let's think about deadweight loss and tax revenue for three different size taxes. So imagine we're thinking about a tax that's put on ice cream. So what if it's a small tax? So a small tax is going to drive a small wedge between what buyers pay and what sellers receive. Right? So it's going to generate some revenue. Because you've got tax times quantity. So this rectangle then is our tax revenue, and this triangle, that's our deadweight loss. So a small tax doesn't reduce quantity a whole lot, so deadweight loss isn't huge, but neither is tax revenue. So let's suppose that this is Wilmington, North Carolina, a beach town, and they're trying to raise revenue off of tourists. And they say, okay, well, a tax on ice cream, it raises some revenue, but what if we made the tax larger? So, okay, what about sort of a medium-sized tax? So the medium-sized tax drives a bigger wedge between what the buyer pays and what the seller receives than the small tax does. It probably raises more revenue, right? Yeah, it's reducing quantity, but the tax got larger, but the deadweight loss is also larger. Right? So now we're losing more efficiency. We're losing gains from trade because this larger tax is reducing trade further. So if the community says, yeah, the ice cream sellers aren't selling as much, but at least we're getting more tax revenue, let's raise the tax even further. So what if they put in a really large tax? Right, your large tax means now, it's even hard to write tax revenue in there. So we'll say tax revenue, and then this triangle of deadweight loss is really, really large. So in the case of a really large tax, what happens? Tax revenue, right, this rectangle has gotten really skinny. Yeah, it's tall, but it's skinny. So it's entirely possible that with this large tax, the tax revenue is now less than with the medium tax. So why is that? Well, if this is a story about ice cream and taxing ice cream, what are people going to do? I'm going to say, well, maybe I don't need ice cream if it's got this really big tax on it. I'm going to go buy bundt cakes instead. Or I'm going to go find gelato that doesn't have the tax on it. They're going to substitute and move to other stuff. So now your tax revenue is actually shrinking because the distortion, the size of this tax, is pushing people out of this market, and tax revenue might even be going down. So this leads to an idea known as the Laffer Curve. So let's think about that in two other diagrams below, where we're going to try and sum up what we've seen in these three. So if we think about two other diagrams, right? So the first one, let's look at deadweight loss versus the tax size. And then in the other one, let's look at the tax size versus tax revenue. So what happened as the tax size increased? Well, when we had a small tax, deadweight loss was relatively small. When we had a medium tax, it got larger. And when we've got a large tax, it got really large. So what's happening to deadweight loss as the tax is increasing? Deadweight loss is increasing as well. That tax is pushing people out. It's reducing trade, and we're losing those gains from trade. But what happens to tax revenue? So with a small tax, we get sort of a small amount of revenue. With a medium tax, we get more revenue. But with a large tax, we might actually get less revenue. So the idea here is that as the tax size gets larger, revenue increases to a point. to a point where deadweight loss is crowding out so much activity that our tax revenue starts to decrease. This idea, this curve, is known as the Laffer Curve. So why is this called the Laffer Curve? Well, the economist Art Laffer made this famous in the 1980s under the Reagan administration. He famously sketched it on the back of a napkin in a bar, and that led to a major shift in thoughts about policy. So most economists are sympathetic to the idea of a Laffer curve. Yeah, at some point, the tax size can be so large that it reduces activity and tax revenues actually decrease. Where economists disagree with each other is where on this curve are we? And is this idea applicable to all groups and all industries at the same rate, or are they different? In other words, are some people more responsive to taxes than others? And this is where policy gets much more difficult. So the Laffer curve, the general takeaway from it is that there is some optimal level, right? Some optimal point for how large taxes are, the tax rates, versus the tax revenues. There's some maximum point. And if we go beyond that point, we can keep raising tax rates, but tax revenue decreases, right? As we start to raise tax rates, drive a bigger wedge between buyers and sellers, activity decreases even more, such that the tax revenues go down. Now, where do we think we fall? Again, economists disagree on it, but most economists in the U.S. tend to think that most of the time we're somewhere to the left. And if we raise tax rates, we increase tax rates, tax revenues will go up as well. But you don't have to agree with this. This is open for debate, and that's where politics and economics intersect. Hopefully you've got an idea of why these different size taxes affect deadweight loss, tax revenue, and have an understanding for this idea of the Laffer curve. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.